Welcome to the Vaccine Hesitancy podcast. I'm Ty Branch, a researcher with the concept team at the University of Cologne. I'm also a part of the Moral Obligation, Epistemology, and Public Health Research Group examining the case of vaccine hesitancy. The aim of our research group is to inform philosophical discussion about the ethics and rationality of vaccine hesitancy. To help us think about that today is our guest, Stephen John.
Hi, I'm Stephen John. I currently teach in the University of Cambridge in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. And my own research interests are mainly in issues around the relationship between political philosophy, philosophy of science, and public health policy. So I have interests in screening, in research into health inequalities, and research and into vaccination debates. And in particular, I guess what I'm interested in is a sense in which there might be implicit value judgments made in scientific work, and how those value judgments may differ from the values of the public. And in that kind of case, what should we do? I mean, that's a big theme across all the different areas I do. And of course, it's particularly relevant in the vaccination case.
Can you say a little bit more about how value judgments come into play in the vaccination case?
Yes, so it's of course, there's lots of different ways of understanding this, but I think there are maybe two or three really interesting kind of examples. One is just when we communicate about vaccines. We talk about vaccines being effective or being safe, but notions of effectiveness or safety, of course, are sort of value laden terms, yeah? Because we talk about something being safe, we mean there's no risk or only a minimal risk of a particular danger. But when you pick out a danger, you're already making a value judgment, what's bad for people. Now, of course, often those value judgments are very uncontroversial. We all agree having an adverse reaction is bad for people. But still, we should be careful to realize when we're making these claims and when we're saying something is safe enough, we're already making a judgment. What are the risks of harm people ought to be willing to tolerate? The second and third examples are slightly more complicated, but one example relates to the ways in which we divide the population up when we do, when we make claims about efficacy or safety. So here's a really interesting example in work by Melissa Leach on the MMR controversy. And so what Leach does is she interviewed various vaccine hesitant parents, and she found again and again they would say something along the lines of, look, I'm willing to accept the vaccine is safe for the average child. I just think my child is special in some way. And what's interesting there is that it's not impossible, of course, that a vaccine could be good on average, but bad for some subpopulation. I mean, we already take account of this when we say that people who are maybe immunocompromised in some way shouldn't necessarily get the vaccine. So the ways in which you divide up a population themselves might involve value judgments. Which are the right populations to look at? What's the right level at which to carve out a population? And then the final example, which I think is really interesting, are notions of how certain we should be a vaccine is safe or effective. So very often, we saw this during COVID. People were very keen to say, look, we haven't cut any corners in vaccine testing. We're as certain of the safety of this vaccine as we are certain of the safety of any vaccine. But of course, you could ask, well, how certain do we have to be? Do we have to be 95% certain the vaccine is safe? 99% certain the vaccine is safe? 99.9% certain the vaccine is safe? And I don't think those questions are themselves scientific questions. Yeah, those are questions about how much risk you're willing to tolerate, how much uncertainty you're willing to tolerate. And I think there are good reasons to believe that those judgments are and should be, in some sense, sensitive to our values. So there's at least three examples in kind of increasing order of complexity or more to less obvious, I guess.
So, how do these judgments then play into types of ethical differences that can occur between vaccination campaigns?
So I think this is a really, really tough question. But one case which has been kind of puzzling me now for, I don't know, a well, at least 16, 18 months, are debates around giving the COVID-19 vaccine to adolescents. So in the UK, decisions about vaccination strategy are made by the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization. And not last summer, but the summer before, the JCVI was basically asked, should we extend the vaccination program to adolescents? Um, and they came up with this really interesting answer where they kind of said, well, look, there's loads of unclear evidence here. And maybe overall it looks like the vaccine is probably kind of okay for kids in that range, but we're very uncertain. And because we're very uncertain, we're going to not, we're going to suggest that the vaccine should not be given to kids, to adolescents. Um, Now, this caused a giant fuss in the UK, and eventually the JCVI's decision was overruled by the chief medical officers. And there's a really complicated story I could go into. I could go into that, but I think the key thing to see for now is they had a choice about what to do under uncertainty. But it just was uncertainty. Yeah, is a vaccine good for adolescents? It's kind of hard to tell because we don't younger people don't get COVID so seriously. There was some evidence to believe that the risk of side effects might be greater the younger you got, but the evidence was all very messy. And so, in the face of uncertainty, they took this highly cautious approach. Um, and then other people came along and they'd say things like, well, if you're not vaccinating the adolescents, aren't you, imposing risk on their teachers, on their parents, on their grandparents, that the children will act as vectors? In this case, I think what you've got really is a big moral debate. How do we want to balance the interests of the individual child, against the interests of the rest of society, the teachers, the parents? And yet the moral debate becomes a debate about certainty. And at precisely this moment, it's hard because debates about how much evidence we have, how certain we are, they look like scientific debates. But really, I suspect they're sort of hidden moral debates. They're moral debates which have been channeled into a scientific debate.
So there's a value-rich component of this that's cached or hiding underneath the scientific discussion going on.
I think that's exactly right. So just consider again the JCVI decision. It's really worth looking at what they did. There's a few different things they do. Yeah. First, when they consider the effects of a vaccine, they only look at medical costs and medical benefits. Okay, so they don't consider things like will the kids be able to go back to school, or like educational costs and benefits. So they have a very limited range of cost and benefit values at play. Second, they explicitly don't consider the possible transmission effects. Yeah, they don't. They explicitly say we are only interested in if a vaccine is good for these children. And finally, when there is all this uncertainty, they adopt this very cautious approach. Now, I think the easiest way to see what's going on there is that basically the JCVI is full of medics, it's full of doctors, understandably. And doctors traditionally place great value on this notion of non maleficence, do no harm. And I think what they were worried about was if they kind of put the vaccine out there and there is some harm to adolescents, this is going to be really bad from a medical perspective. That's going to violate medical ethics. And so, because of that, they focus only on the medical issues. They don't look at the knock on effects. They handle uncertainty in this really, really cautious way. Meanwhile, you look at the critics, the people who are saying, no, vaccinate those kids, give a vaccine in schools. Those people traditionally come from public health areas, which are historically, at least, much more like a utilitarian focus, a focus on doing as much good as possible, the kind of the greatest happiness for the greatest number kind of tradition. And for those people, they're thinking, well, who really cares in some sense if a few kids lose, as long as we maximize for the population? I'm not saying they say this explicitly. I mean, of course, it's not like they're monsters. But I think that from their perspective, the correct way to think about vaccination is in terms of overall population effects. Yeah? And so then they handle stuff very differently. They look at different costs and benefits. They look at transmission. They don't get so worried about uncertainty. And so what you have is you have two moral perspectives, two moral camps fighting it out. Um, but they're fighting it out in this kind of super technical way, which means that, for a member of the public, it's kind of deeply confusing. For a parent or an adolescent themselves, what should I do? Is really unclear.
Let's talk a little bit more then about what the public ends up doing. So, you've written about Maya Goldenberg's work and how her approach to understanding vaccine hesitancy really emphasizes the non epistemic values that people, parents especially, consider when deciding whether or not to vaccinate their children.
So I think there's something really interesting which goes on in debates about vaccine hesitancy, and something like Maya Goldenberg's work fits into this in really interesting ways. Yeah, where often in public debate, public kind of discourse, when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, it's very much framed in terms of the vaccine hesitant people are just stupid. So Boris Johnson, the ex-British Prime Minister, when he was asked by people who were vaccine hesitant about the COVID vaccine, he said they're nuts, just nuts. And then everyone says, well, that's too blunt. We should be more understanding and kind. But often the people who say we should be more understanding and kind secretly believe vaccine hesitant people are just nuts. They just think we should be kind as a way of, encouraging them to see the light. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, well, I think this assumption that vaccine hesitancy is stupid is really challenged in lots of ways. Yeah. One way to see it is, of course, most people who get vaccinated don't do so on the basis of lots of evidence, lots of reasoning, and so on. I think about, when I take my own kids to get, let's say, the MMR jab. What happens? I just get a letter from a doctor. I'm a good parent. I just go along, get the jab. I haven't done lots of research. So it strikes me with, in some sense, the vaccine hesitant are typically doing much more research than the vaccine willing. They're certainly not stupid in that sense. But also, when you look at the literature, what's really fascinating is, there's a very old tradition in economics, which sort of talks about what's called free riding. So free riding is where basically everyone else contributes to some public good, but you then realize you don't need to contribute yourself. So, for example, if everyone else gets vaccinated, there's no point me getting vaccinated because it's just a little cost, and I get the benefit anyway of protection. So, economists traditionally have thought of vaccine hesitancy as being super rational, just antisocial. Yeah. Similarly, where you look at the anthropological work on vaccine hesitancy, and the anthropologists will point out the ways in which vaccination is linked to notions of the body, the self, the way we relate to the world. And so then they'll provide a way of understanding vaccine hesitancy as grounded in our self understanding. Then you turn to philosophy, and the philosophers will have these very interesting arguments about how, given the role of these non epistemic value judgments in vaccine science, sometimes we can have disagreements about non epistemic values. So maybe, the scientists say, well, we're certain the vaccine is safe. But if a parent says, well, it's not certain enough for me, it's not clear the parent is making a straightforward mistake. And so I think there's actually something really weird here because economists, philosophers, and anthropologists hate one another. They disagree on absolutely everything, apart from the fact that vaccine hesitancy might not be stupid. And then there's this amazing agreement. And so I take it you have someone like Goldenberg, who in this context is really interested in suggesting the various different ways in which vaccine hesitancy might stem from an awareness of the ways in which the medical system is problematic, ways in which research system is problematic, the ways in which maybe medical institutions are still institutionally racist, and so on. Um, and I think that's all really interesting and really important. I guess my worry in these cases, and this is a really tough worry, is the potential gap between all of the very good reasons we as philosophers or anthropologists or economists or whatever might suggest why people might be vaccine hesitant and how that relates to the actual phenomenon of vaccine hesitancy. Yeah. I could give you kind of a really complicated argument about why medical racism might lead someone to be vaccine hesitant. But you look at lots of people who are actually vaccine hesitant, that's not their argument. Their argument is more like Bill Gates is microchipping me. And so then there's a question how to understand the relationship between possibly rational, possibly makes sense, and what actually happens on the ground.
Right. So let me pick out something that you said there. Parents that, for example, say, not certain enough for me, the evidence isn't certain enough for me to vaccinate my child. Speak a little bit more about in what instances it might be ethical to overrule parental authority, if ever.
So I wish I knew. So I think there are two things going on here. Yeah. One thing is, I think it's really important when we think about parents and children to note that there might be cases where there are risks you're willing to run yourself, but those same risks are not risks you'd be willing to impose on someone else, particularly your own child. Yeah, I think this myself. Yeah. Like, if it's just me, I might be willing to kind of, I don't know, cross the road to save some time. But if I'm with my kids, I'll walk down the road and take the traffic lights. And I think there's something very important about the notion that when you have some position of care, part of what's involved in caring for other people is handling risks and uncertainties in a very cautious way. Yeah. So I think there's an automatic problem when it comes to parental decision making around children, which is parents are primed and perhaps even morally obliged to look for high levels of certainty, to look for low levels of risk, because that's their job as parents. Yeah? The problem is, on the other hand, you might think there are all sorts of interesting arguments in the literature as to why sometimes getting vaccinated is some kind of moral duty. So it's controversial, but there's something interesting in it. There's a very nice discussion by Jessica Flanagan, where Flanagan talks about she imagines someone who sits outside their house and just on the 4th of July and fires a gun in the air, and then the bullets come down and kill people. And Flanagan is like, look, that's just morally wrong. You shouldn't go around imposing risks of harm on other people by firing your gun like crazy. I mean, I agree. And then she says, and not getting vaccinated is a bit like that. Yeah, not getting vaccinated is a bit like you're going around shooting people, like shooting your bullets up in the air, because you might be spreading the illness everywhere. Now, I mean, I'm not entirely certain Flanagan's argument works, but still, I think she's onto something. With our reasons to vaccinate aren't just to help ourselves, but to help other people. But yeah, I think that this now gives you a really deep tension in the vaccination of children. Because you might want to say, from one perspective, most children are morally obliged to vaccinate. Otherwise, it is like they're going around shooting the gun, kind of by analogy. On the other hand, the parents are obliged not to let any risk of harm occur to their own child. And so you have a really deep tension. Yeah. And in that case, you're entirely right. The key question becomes, to what extent can we override parental authority? On that question, I wish I knew the answer. I think what's going on there is roughly we've got two models of understanding parental authority in philosophy, in law, and so on. On one model, parents are a bit like it's a bit like they just own their kids. Yeah, parents have
Mhm.
authority because kids are just like their property. So if I want to not vaccinate my kid, it's my choice. The same way, if I want to smash my cup, it's my choice. On that model, it's really hard. It's really hard to justify interference. Um, there's another model though where I think we think of parental authority as more something you get as a kind of. It's because in general, parents obviously care for their kids. They know best. They know what's best for their kids. Parental authority is just like a way of really ensuring kids flourish in general. But it's not as if parents own their kids. So if we have a case where we know it very definitely what the parent is choosing is not in the interests of a child, then we can intervene. Um, which of those models is correct in a big philosophical sense? I don't know. I suspect the second, but we could argue about it. What's really hard in practice is lots of people obviously reason in the first mode. Yeah, lots of people do kind of think of their children as you know interfering with my choices about my kids. It's really not on. Yeah, it's like my kid is mine in some sense.
It seems that part of this as well, given the first example you gave about vaccinating teenagers, that the age of the child matters quite a bit.
Yes, of course. So you're right, but the older you get, the more we want to shift attention away from a parent choosing for a child and to allow the child to make a choice for themselves. And of course, there's lots of kind of legal cases, uh, at least in the UK context, which I know best, about the exact age at which you no longer need parental agreement or parental consent. Um, and so I I agree. It matters as a child gets older who you shift decision making power over to. I suspect what that speaks to is more like that second model I said. It's not that parents get authority because they have rights. It's not like I own my kid until they're 18, and then I don't own them anymore because that does seem weird. Exactly, this notion of gradualism does speak to this notion that parents in general get to make decisions about their kids because in general they know best, and the younger the child is, the stronger that argument is. Um, but still, yeah, yeah. There's a lot to be said about children, and philosophers are kind of funny about it. It's really odd. Often we talk about vaccination, and we talk about vaccination campaigns being paternalistic, but very often this notion of paternalism is really weird because it's like you're taking away a parent's choice. And that's in some sense the opposite of paternalism. Paternalism is a notion, but a parent chooses for a child, and that's a model of one kind of decision making. But vaccination campaigns take away parental choice in funny ways. It's a rich area, a complex area.
I would certainly agree. And so let's explore some of that richness, given your expertise in political philosophy as well. You said that decisions to vaccinate can resemble voting behavior. What does this mean for determining key drivers of vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah, so this is just almost in some sense, I think this is a really obvious way to think about it. But it's amazing to me that often people working on vaccination campaigns don't see this. So think about how people vote. Yeah, people vote on the basis of a really funny combination of different factors. Yeah, partly they vote on the basis of what they believe is in their best interests. Yeah, if I vote for this person, will I pay more tax or less tax? Will the local hospital be better or worse for me? So partly our voting behaviour is about prudential, good or bad for me. But obviously, it's not just about that. When we vote, we also take account of broader moral considerations. Maybe I think, well, if I vote for this guy, I'll pay more tax, but the hospital system would be much better, and that would be morally good. So it's both personal, prudential, and moral considerations. But there's more. There's also kind of identity signaling. There's a kind of sense of, people like me vote for people like this. You know, if I tell my friend it's who I voted for, they'll laugh at me if and so on. There's kind of membership of a particular crowd or group. And I take it, what's interesting about vaccination choices is they have something similar. So often when we talk about vaccination, we'll say, well, look, the vaccine, we've showed it's safe and effective. So clearly, people should be willing to get vaccinated. But when we say that, what we're really doing is we're just appealing to one issue, the kind of prudential, is it good or bad for me? It'd be as if we looked at voting behavior in the UK and you said to me, Steve, isn't it weird? There are these people who, they'd be much better off voting for party X, but instead they vote for party Y. And I'd just be like, well, that's a bit kind of naive. Because people don't just vote on the basis of their own interests, they vote on the basis of piles of other stuff. It's similarly in the case of vaccination. I think decisions to vaccinate or not, sure, they're partly driven by what's good or bad for me, but they're also driven by a sense of what's good or bad for sort of society generally, a kind of moral concern. And they're also driven by a sense of identity. And of course, this is exactly what various anti vaccination campaigns have picked up on so strongly recently. The notion that vaccination is somehow politically coded in some way, but to be skeptical about vaccination is linked into a broader political identity, the same way voting behavior is. So I think when we think about vaccine hesitancy, we really need to go beyond the focus on the kind of why don't people see it's good for them? Because that's not what's always driving it. It would be as if you were kind of in charge of a political campaign. You're like, we just need to explain to people our tax reforms will save them lots of money. And you might be like, well, there's more going on. There's just more going on.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about vaccine hesitancy and the ways in which it's a complex issue. One of the fun things we get to do as philosophers is think about what changing a system would look like so that maybe we have different challenges. What are some of the risks with changing our systems that we currently have?
It's a really good question. So I'll say really bluntly. I mean, nearly everyone who's interested in vaccine hesitancy is interested in the topic because, in some sense, they want to get around it. They want to make sure people do get vaccinated. And I think that's entirely admirable. It's driven by real humanitarian concern. Um, I I share the wish to overcome lots of vaccine hesitancy. On the other hand, I'm always really, really worried or reluctant to make any kind of strong normative recommendation here. And the reason I think it's precisely what you were just suggesting. It's because I think lots of vaccine hesitancy stems from just having free speech, political disagreement. I think it's linked in to those phenomena. And I think it might be linked in ways which mean it's almost impossible to to just target just vaccine hesitancy, as it were. Yeah, I think what you might really want to do is I think the only way to combat it would be something much more systemic about controlling the flow of information. But controlling the flow of information at a really systemic level doesn't just stop the bad information, the kind of vaccine hesitant stuff. It stops what's really important in democratic societies. It stops disagreement. Um, so I tend to think of vaccine hesitancy as, in some sense, just an inevitable consequence of having a democratic public space. Um, and then not being much you can do without threatening the public space, public debate, which is very depressing. I agree.
When we think about the flow of information, a lot of this passes through social media, but also through institutions. What do you think the role of institutions is in this? How should we think about them, engage them?
I think we're caught here between two issues. One issue is I think we've got very strong norms which tell us that when we want to communicate, when we want to build trust at an institutional level, the best way to do that is to kind of be open, to be transparent, to admit uncertainty, to admit doubt, and so on. And these are very much often the kind of buzzwords you'll hear. But we want institutions to communicate to people. We want people to trust institutions. Well, then we need to acknowledge uncertainty. We need to, in some sense, be transparent. And to a very large extent, I agree. Okay. The problem is that um, There's an old quote from Bismarck, who said something like, "Laws are like sausages, where if you looked inside the sausage factory, you'd never eat a sausage." Yeah, and I kind of feel the same about a lot of science. Yeah, a lot of science is done in ways where, when you look at the inner workings of the science factory, it looks kind of weird and kind of strange. Also, partly I think being transparent can be problematic because when the institution is transparent, if people don't really understand what's going on inside the system, this can lead them not to place trust, even in cases where they should. Yeah. Um, and I'm not saying this because I believe people are stupid in any way, shape, or form. It's just, it's a complicated process developing a vaccine, testing for safety, testing for efficacy. And when you look at how it's done, it's entirely normal, I think, to go, what? That's what they have to do? Why do we do? There's a sense in which making the process open makes it seem less trustworthy. And second, I think more importantly, these notions of transparency and openness and honesty, in some sense, they confuse what we want institutions to do for us. What we want the institution to do for us is just to control the flow of information. Yeah. When I go to my doctor, I don't want I say, "Doctor, what's wrong with me?" I don't want the doctor to say, "Well, Steve, here's like loads of copies of the New England Journal of Medicine. Have a look yourself and figure it out." It's like, well, yeah, I just want the doctor to tell me, yeah? Similarly, I think when we have institutions communicating to us about vaccine safety, in some sense, we don't want them to be telling us all the complexity and all the transparency and all the detail. We just want them to say, "Steve, it's okay." Or at least most of us do. Um, and so I think that institutions are caught in this very hard kind of double bind, where if they aren't transparent, they get attacked for not being transparent and open. But if they are transparent and open, in some sense, it can be self undermining. And also, it's just not necessarily very useful for most audiences. Um, the trick there is to build institutions which people trust, where we trust the institution to handle the information properly, to control the flow of information properly. Um, but yeah, building that kind of trust is hard. It's really hard, and I don't think it's helped often by kind of saying, "Well, this is just about science." I think we need to acknowledge it's about more than science. It's about political trust as well.
So, would it be fair to say then that even though so much emphasis has been placed on the idea of trust in science as the real problem underlying vaccine hesitancy, that it's much richer than that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think we often talk about trust in science, but we're not entirely certain what we mean by that phrase. And perhaps more importantly, in a way, often we don't care about trust in science. I mean, there are lots of cases. So, I have friends who are chemists, and sometimes, they'll complain. They'll see a shampoo for sale at a shop, and the shampoo will say, "Doesn't contain any chemicals." And the chemists are like, "Oh, that's awful. That's crazy. Everything contains chemicals, blah, blah, blah." They kind of, but you know what? In some sense, who cares? Yeah. If there are people going around the world who believe this, believe that, we don't really mind. So, in some sense, people not believing science, not trusting science, not understanding science, it's not an issue. We get around it. It only becomes an issue in a case like vaccination, where your decision affects me. You don't get vaccinated, I get affected. But what that tells us, I think, is exactly even when we care about science and trusting science, we don't really care about trusting science. We care about trusting science for broadly political reasons. It's about living together, not imposing risks of harm on each other. And so then I think we need to understand it's not really about science. It's about politics. It's about living together in ways which are acceptable. Of course, politics is tricky because politics is often understood as a field of contestation and disagreement and debate. And I think for a long while we had this hope that science was going to stand above it. Science would be what both sides in debate would agree on. So if you had trust in science, you had a shared common ground. But yeah, that may be what's disappeared. That notion that science can be outside the political. Um, What we do about it, I don't know. I don't know. I wish I did.
Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about, many different aspects of the problem to analyze to help us maybe come to some further understanding, if not a final answer. Stephen John, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. No,
It
thank
was a
you.
pleasure.
It was really enjoyable. Thank you.